251.
Ow.
252.
Ow.
I told Cody here to make my website look great, and when I went to check it out, it said he made 404 errors. That means 404 whacks. 253.
Ow. I should have used Squarespace. Ow.
Throughout the late 50s and 60s, one extraordinary person was climbing their way through the ranks of television. Her name was Joan Gans Cooney. As a public television producer, she was creating some of the most provocative and challenging programming of the civil rights era on New York's public television station, WNDT. At a dinner party in 1966, a conversation between her and Lloyd Morissette, an executive at the notable nonprofit, the Carnegie Corporation, sparked an interesting question. Could television be used to teach children? Complaints of the abundance of sex and violence on television, as well as the influence of advertisements, had brought upon a national debate as to the negative effects these trends could be having on the children watching. There were a few popular programs directed at young children, such as Captain Kangaroo, but shows such as this were the outliers. While the entertainment aspects of these programs were great, the execution of the educational aspects was lacking. Morissette, who was also an experimental psychologist, wondered if a program designed primarily to educate children could be successful. Gans Cooney, known for never being afraid to step outside of her comfort zone, found the proposition interesting. After the conversation, she secured research funding for an educational children's program. She spoke to many experts in the field of early childhood development and educational media. When she returned with her report, titled The Potential Uses of Television in Preschool Education, WNDT rejected it. After this, she left the station, joining Morissette at the Carnegie Corporation in a full-time role. Over the next 2 years, Gans Cooney and Morissette sought funding for their program, starting the nonprofit production company, the Children's Television Workshop. The two would eventually raise over $8 million for the show, spending a large amount on research alone. Gans Cooney would be appointed as the executive director of the Children's Television Workshop, a monumental achievement in the male-dominated and biased television industry. She and Morissette would begin to grow their team, eventually adding television writer and director John Stone to help with the show's creative development. It became clear through the research process that in order to capture the attention of preschool children, the program would need to be fast-paced, visually colorful, and creative in its execution. Gans Cooney pointed to television commercials as a comparable to the type of segments the show would need to have. Luckily, if she needed high-quality creative commercials, Stone knew the perfect person to do it.
Hello there, my name is Jim Henson, and I'm a puppeteer. I'm called a puppeteer because I work with puppets.
Okay, you're gonna love this story. Greatest story in the world. Hey, thank you, and welcome again to another Muppet Show.
In the summer of 1968, it was business as usual at Muppets Inc., now operating under the new name Henson Associates. The company was still producing entertaining commercials for a variety of clients. Jim and his team continued to appear on variety shows performing Muppet skits, and the Muppets were creating the occasional television special and pilot. Two pilots, 1962's Tales of the Tinker-Dee and 1964's The Land of the Tinker-Dee, featuring a group of medieval Muppets in a fairy tale kingdom, never saw the light of day. In 1965, Jim had been asked to bring the Muppets onto a pilot for a Snow White parody being developed by John Stone for CBS. Jim and Stone hit it off, and the duo would collaborate on other projects, including an episode for NBC's Experiment in Television, a program that was satisfying Jim's passion for experimental film. Now, in mid-1968, they were a few months away from shooting the project that came from the Snow White parody, although the program had moved from CBS to ABC and the leading princess had been changed to Cinderella. After Stone joined the Children's Television Workshop, he would not hesitate to invite Jim to some of the developmental meetings. Jim shyly sat in the back of the conference room, slouching low in his chair as he would often do. When he was finally introduced to Gans Cooney, his work preceded him. Jim's quiet nature was overshadowed by the Muppets' reputation for the loud and the chaotic, and those at CTW, especially Gans Cooney, were thrilled that he might bring that energy to their new show. Jim, on the other hand, was hesitant. If he provided the Muppets for the preschool program, he could risk the thing he wanted most, a primetime Muppet series. Using the Muppets for the young demographic could solidify their reputation as children's entertainment, a verdict that would be detrimental to any pitch for a family or adult-style Muppet show. However, this concern was overshadowed by the mere fact that he respected what Gans Cooney and CTW was doing. They were pushing the boundaries of television, a personal goal of his as well. Plus, he couldn't deny that the format that they were describing was perfect for him and the Muppets. He eventually agreed to work for the show, believing that, due to the unpredictable nature of children's programming, it would probably only last a month or two anyways. Jim demanded his typical condition, that he own the rights to any Muppet characters he created for the program. During negotiations, Jim would end up allowing a 50-50 split of any character merchandising from the show between him and CTW. Henson and his team would begin in 1969, and Jim and Stone's Cinderella spoof was set to film in late 1968. The hour-long special, called Hey Cinderella, received mixed reviews when it aired in the spring of 1969. The most notable part of the special would be that it officially completed Kermit's transition from abstract monster to frog, a gradual transformation in design that produced the recognizable version of the beloved character.
I know I'm a frog, you don't have to keep reminding me.
Throughout 1969, Jim and his team worked to produce their scenes for the CTW project. The Muppets would create small insert segments teaching children about letters and numbers that would then be placed in between the show's street segments, which featured the main storyline of human actors. Jim took creative liberty with his part of the show, not only creating Muppet segments, but shooting live action and animated sequences as well. One of the first assignments for Henson was to create the pitch reel for the show, which had recently been given the name Sesame Street.
Hey, these kids can't read or write, can they?
No,
Then how's about we call the show Hey Stupid?
Hey, stupid. What are we gonna do for a title?
Hey, Ralph? Why don't you call your show Sesame Street?
My entire career as a TV educator nipped in the... What was that? Kermit. Why, you're a genius. Mwah!
Yuck.
Sesame Street. I love it. The kids will love it. I can see it. Up there in lights, the Children's Television Workshop presents Sesame Street.
New Muppets would need to be created for the puppet segments of Sesame Street. Two of the residents would be a pair of roommates named Bert and Ernie, performed by Frank Oz and Jim respectively. The gruff, stern Bert would be constantly pestered by the squeaky-voiced, goofy Ernie, not unlike the more serious Oz and the often goofy Henson. The comedic relationship between Ernie and Bert was immediate, likely because Oz and Henson's friendship was so strong. A semi-new character was a blue, googly-eyed monster with a large appetite performed by Oz utilizing a painfully gravelly voice. The character had evolved from previous Muppets that the team had used in various commercials throughout the years, and throughout the first season of Sesame Street, he would be given the name Cookie Monster. Kermit would also be used in many segments to teach concepts, acting as one of the few mature Sesame Street Muppets. A few test cuts of the show were created using Jim's segments and other footage shot by CTW, and the episodes were shown to the show's target demographic. These early tests revealed that children's attentions dropped significantly during the show's street segments in which only human actors were shown. It was then decided that Muppets would need to be added to the main setting of the program. This wasn't exactly good news for Jim. He could easily provide the show's inserts, as he could create them in bulk on his own shooting schedule. But becoming members of a cast would mean a more strenuous time commitment. He could assign his fellow performers Frank Oz or Jerry Nelson to the post, but they had proven to be indispensable in the Muppets' year-round work on various projects. This meant Jim needed new talent, so as he had done year after year, he returned to the Puppeteers of America convention, this time seeking out a young puppeteer named Carol Spinney, who he had met a few years prior. He convinced Spinney to come work on Sesame Street full-time, performing two characters for the street segments, a large childlike yellow bird named Big Bird, and a grumpy, trash-dwelling orange monster named Oscar the Grouch. The position was perfect for Spinney as he seemed to excel in solo performances as opposed to a member of an ensemble. He set up shop in New York in 1969, and he would immediately give life to the full-bodied Big Bird puppet, performing him as a naive, curious character that children could relate to, at the urging of Jim, who thought the character could be very popular with the audience. Popular would be an understatement. Sesame Street premiered on November 10th, 1969 on National Educational Television. The show instantly became popular among the young children tuning in, and it would start a national dialogue on the roles and responsibilities of children's entertainment. The show featured a diverse cast of human characters, and it would have to overcome widespread racism and prejudice. But the decision to feature a realistic cast was one of the show's best. There were a few critics of the show during its first few months on the air, but the consensus seemed to be that Sesame Street was a groundbreaking and incredible show, one that would remain on the air and in the minds of children for years to come. This was great news for everyone except Jim Henson. While he was thrilled the show was successful and was even more happy to see his 50% of merchandising sales over the next few years, the popularity of Sesame Street, largely thanks to his and the Muppets' contributions, had realized his worst fear. He was now a children's puppeteer. This wouldn't become an issue right away, as he made plans to capitalize off of Sesame Street's success with other Muppet specials for children. When he would eventually try to step outside of this demographic, he would learn just how strong of a reputation Sesame Street had given him. With the flexibility of the show's shooting schedule thanks to Spinney's work, Jim pursued a script for a children's special written by Jewel entitled The Great Santa Claus Switch, in which an evil magician takes Santa's place on Christmas Eve to steal from homes. The script had been rejected countless times over the past few years, but to Jim's delight, Ed Sullivan, who had frequently invited the Muppets on his program, offered to air the special in place of an episode of his show. The good news meant that Henson would have to hire additional puppeteers, and in the summer of 1970, Oz, Nelson, and Henson opened auditions for additional Muppet performers. This resulted in 2 new puppeteers joining the team, Fran Brill and Richard Hunt. Both were a perfect fit for the Muppets. The Great Santa Claus Switch saw the introduction of a group of monsters named the Frackles as the henchmen for the film's villain. These would continue to be used in other Muppet works, and one Frackle, referred to as the Cigar Box Frackle, would eventually evolve a knack for adrenaline. The Great Santa Claus Switch was well received, but had little cultural impact upon its premiere in December of 1970. Jim, pleased with the results, was already on to his next project. The next year, Henson began development on a follow-up to Hey Cinderella, now billed as the anthology series Tales from Muppetland. The second film in the series, The Frog Prince, would be filmed in March of 1971. The film featured Kermit alongside a new cast of Muppet frogs, including the small Robin performed by Jerry Nelson.
They call me Sir Robin, the Brave.
A new full-body Muppet would also be introduced, an ogre named Sweetums, performed by Richard Hunt. The growing fan base of Sesame Street resulted in more attention for Tales from Muppetland. The team would shoot another special for the series, The Muppet Musicians of BREMEN, in 1972, adding a full cast of rats and chickens to the Muppets. While the ensemble of Muppet performers was enough to fulfill the various projects, the Muppet Workshop needed additional hands. Builder Don Saleen, a master at his craft, and a recent addition, the talented Bonnie Erickson, would be joined by 2 new designers, Franz Vizakis, a builder that specialized in adding unique mechanisms to each puppet, and Dave Goelz, a puppeteer with little confidence in his performances. The workshop was now preparing for a Broadway show starring the Muppets that Jim had been pitching to investors, titled An Evening with the Muppets. Plans for the show would be canceled in late 1973, and Jim set his sights back on television. His hope was to secure a series of Muppet holiday specials, or ideally, a weekly show. Henson, Oz, and Nelson would come into office after office, getting rejected by executive after executive, who was either uninterested or confused by the pitches. The consistent concern seemed to be that puppets, including the dynamic Muppets, were merely children's entertainment, as proved by Sesame Street. Luckily, Jim would eventually convince one of the suits, a young, energetic executive at ABC named Michael Eisner. Eisner loved the Muppets and the pitch, and he would greenlight a pilot for a weekly Muppet series. While Jim imagined the series as a disjointed variety show starring the Muppets and human guest stars, for this pilot he wanted to explore one of his Muppet holiday special concepts, deciding on the Muppet Valentine Show. Jim and his team would shoot the special in late 1973 and finish it in January of 1974. The show was written by Jewel and co-writer Jerry Ross, and Jim's hope for a human guest star would be fulfilled with Mia Farrow joining the cast of the Muppets. The show had an interesting format. It was hosted by a Muppet named Wally, the show's screenwriter that was having a difficult time writing about love. The Muppets, living in a house with overgrown foliage, helped him describe the feeling of love from each of their own twisted perspectives. The show would also implement a variety of musical numbers throughout. Other featured Muppets included the army of frogs from The Frog Prince, a Frackle, Kermit, who was given a hilarious musical fantasy segment with the song Froggy Went A-Courtin'.
The bigger they are, the harder they fall. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, and you're gonna fall, big mouth and all.
And a few newcomers. The new Muppets included Brewster, a Muppet both designed and performed by Dave Goelz in his first step outside of the workshop, Mildred, Miss Mousy, and Thog, all performed by Jerry Nelson, George the Janitor, performed by Frank Oz,
Moops.
and a maniac arsonist named Crazy Donald, performed by semi-frequent performer John Lovelady. There were also a new race of Muppets from the fictional planet of Coosbane, and one of the show's segments featured the species demonstrating their alien mating ritual. The 25-minute-long pilot aired on January 30th, 1974. Critics and audiences loved the energetic and funny special, and ABC opened the door for Jim to produce more holiday specials and pilots. Later that year, the Muppets would appear on Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, a special starring the jazz musician in which the Muppets would add a comedic element to the band's set. The Often Forgot special is notable in that one of the Muppet interruptions featured a newly built character, and in less than 2 minutes of screen time, a star was born.
Piggy, come on in here, Piggy. Herbie, I'd like to meet Piggy. Piggy dolls, chirp.
Hey, baby, this is your letter to success, Piggy Doll. I've been telling him all about you.
Hello, Mr. Alpert.
Beautiful, beautiful.
What are some of the other puppets that you've developed?
Oh, I guess, well, the ones on Sesame Street are the ones people know most. Big Bird and Oscar and Ernie Bert.
In most places, frogs and puppets are for adults, but in this country they're for children. How do you account for that? Either one can answer that.
Oh, okay. Well, well, I think we're, in terms of the Muppets, we're working to sort of do some things different. We're working on an adult television show right now, and we're working on a theater show. So we hope to do a few things for adults.
Could I ask Kermit something?
Sure.
Jim would pitch another pilot for a weekly show to ABC called The Muppet Nonsense Show, which would include more sketches and short segments. This time, however, he was determined to reach a more adult audience to further distance himself from Sesame Street, which was by this point a cultural phenomenon. When the second pilot was greenlit, Jim would title it The Muppet Show, Sex and Violence, to emphasize the targeted adult audience and comment on the current state of television. The show would be shot in mid-December. The pilot centered around a group of Muppets putting on a variety show, culminating into a pageant for the 7 deadly sins, each represented by a grotesque, stylized Muppet. The show was also a lot more quick-paced and cynical than the Muppets' Valentine show, and the Muppet Workshop was tasked with creating an even larger ensemble of new characters. This would include a new house band called the Electric Mayhem, featuring a keyboardist, Dr. Teeth, performed by Henson, a guitar player, Janice, performed by Fran Brill, a saxophone player, Zoot, played by Dave Goelz, the sarcastic bassist, Floyd, performed by Jerry Nelson, and the wild and violent drummer, Animal, performed by Frank Oz. There were also a series of skits featuring 2 elderly gentlemen, Statler, performed by Richard Hunt, and Waldorf, performed by Henson, who passed the time making small talk in their antiquated home.
And so the waiter says, "Excuse me, but you're dancing with my umbrella."
There was a cooking show segment with a Swedish chef demonstrating some unconventional cooking methods and less than accurate Swedish. The chef had been born from previous chef skits that the Muppets had performed. The character was a live hand Muppet, similar to Ralph and Ernie. In typical live hand Muppet performances, the head and left arm are performed by the primary puppeteer providing the voice, while a second performer would operate the right hand, a job referred to as simply right-handing. The Swedish chef was unique in that the character would be voiced by Jim, but he would only be controlling the head. The hands would both be controlled by a second puppeteer, Richard Hunt in the Sex and Violence pilot, with his actual human hands being used. This created an entirely different performance style, as Jim would be providing humorous dialogue and facial expressions, not necessarily knowing what the hands of the Muppet would do next.
First the woof woof. Hey, first the Hamel. Hey, I'll get the bloomer spoot. This is her. Met Greg the Bengal Club.
The Sex and Violence Swedish chef skits also featured Chinese subtitles, another odd element to the skit. Running the show backstage was Floyd, Sam the Eagle, a large blue eagle with a strong moral backbone played by Oz, and perhaps the most peculiar addition to the Muppet cast in Sex and Violence, the show's host, a nasally, almost drowsy frontman named Nigel, played by Jim.
What we have here is the conference room, which is sort of the nerve center of the place.
Nigel had little character or charm, especially considering his role as host. Kermit and Rolf, the established dynamic and recognizable Muppet host, would appear only briefly, as would various other Muppets that Jim had built for the previous pilots and specials.
Yeah, well, I might be able to get you a job on an educational show for kids.
Well, I was with Jimmy Dean, but nobody remembers me anymore.
A variety of segments were created for the pilot, including Mount Rushmore, in which the 4 presidents would tell bad jokes, and a fake movie review segment called Return to Beneath the Planet of the Pigs, a Planet of the Apes parody featuring a new version of Piggy, performed by Fran Brill, and a mad scientist pig named Dr. Naga, played by Jerry Nelson. There was also a segment called At the Dance, where a series of gags were played off as Muppets danced in a ballroom. The special ended with a wide shot revealing the Muppet performers beneath the puppets, an idea originally conceived for the Muppet Broadway show, and an ending that would have presumably continued should the show have been picked up. However, this was not the case. ABC was unhappy with the pilot from the beginning, urging Jim to change the name and the special. He stood firm on the Sex and Violence title, which seemed to be more funny to him than anyone else. Another issue was the show's characters, whose personalities did not work together as an ensemble. It seemed that in each scene from the pilot's A-plot, a different character was halting the energy, whether it be Nigel with his sleepy, dull delivery, or Sam with his strict obliviousness. It didn't help that most of the time the characters backstage were not preparing for the show, but were instead playing board games. On top of this, the show's pacing was atrocious, and the editing was too quick in some segments and too long in others. The At the Dance and the Swedish Chef segments which both only had enough footage to be a single insert, were chopped up and placed throughout, with some bits lasting less than 10 seconds.
Well, you see, this show jumps from place to place. You'll get used to it.
Despite these issues, Jim hoped that this was the pilot that would solidify a weekly Muppet show. Jim made the rounds on late-night shows, heavily promoting the airing of the pilot.
Are you going to be on the special tomorrow night, Kermit?
No.
You're not on the special?
No, you know, they gave me one lousy line.
When the reviews came in, it was clear that sex and violence had not resonated with audiences. While some found it entertaining, a majority of viewers felt the humor didn't work, and ABC decided against picking up the series. Jim was hopeful that another network would, but was disappointed when others rejected the concept as well, some because of the response to the special, and others because of the same reason Jim had been hearing again and again. They felt puppets were for children in the morning, not adults at night. If a Muppet TV series was going to happen, Jim would need help, so he reached out to a person that he believed could make his dream come true. An IBM executive named David Laser that Jim had worked with in the past to provide a few funny short films for IBM board meetings. Laser would join the Muppets team in a producing capacity, and his knowledge of business and energy would prove to be an asset that the team had been missing. The first step was to create a pitch to networks. This would take the form of a 25-minute reel featuring the Muppets in a variety of settings, in short skits, interacting with humans, and in musical numbers. The climax of the reel would feature an enthusiastic Muppet pitchman making his case to the network executives to greenlight a Muppet show.
Friends, the United States of America needs the Muppet Show, and you should buy this show. Now, we're not pulling any punches here. I mean, there's nothing subtle about this pitch. So buy the show and put it on the air, and we'll all be famous. And we'll all get temperamental and hard to work with, but you won't care, because we'll all make a lot of money. And God will look down on us and smile on us, and he will say, let them have a 40 share.
Jim's agent, Bernie Brillstein, would shop the reel around to no avail. During this process, Brillstein had made a deal with NBC to have the Muppets appear on a new live variety show debuting in the fall of 1975. The Muppets were brought on to assuage the fears of executives that the new show, named Saturday Night Live, would be too edgy as it took on the hot topics of the day. This was perfect for Jim's attempts to get the Muppets into the adult comedy scene. Lorne Michaels, SNL's showrunner and also a client of Brillstein, enjoyed Jim's work and was happy to have him perform a skit on each episode of the show. Jim's recurring sketch would be called The Land of Gorge and would feature mature alien Muppets in adult situations. The Muppets were designed by recent Workshop edition Michael Frith, and the bizarre aliens certainly looked the part for late night. However, the Muppets and SNL were not a match. Per Writers Guild rules, all the sketches had to be written by SNL staff writers, and their subtle, sarcastic style did not lend itself well to the more slapstick Muppets. That said, the writers weren't necessarily trying their hardest. They would have much rather written the other sketches, and those forced to write for the Muppets were often angry. Head writer Michael O'Donoghue reportedly scoffed, quote, "I won't write for felt." The cast also did not enjoy giving up airtime to the Muppets. Cast member John Belushi's anger would lead him to coin the phrase, mucking fuppets. It was difficult for Jim to bring his team every week into a tense situation where they clearly weren't welcome. Although despite the behind-the-scenes drama, he would never speak ill of the SNL staff publicly. And when asked, he would be quick to praise the talents of Lorne Michaels, who he had a deep respect for. Michaels appreciated Jim's work, but it was clear early on to the both of them that the Muppets did not belong on SNL. Luckily, Jim wouldn't have to live in 30 Rock forever. A British television producer named Lou Grade had been following the work of Jim and the Muppets for the past few years, and he was interested in discussing a potential Muppet TV series. One of his employees located in New York invited Brillstein and Laser to a meeting. The two passed on the 25-minute pitch reel, and the next day, a deal was made. A 24-episode first season with a total budget of $3 million would be produced. The episodes would be distributed via a new practice called primetime syndication, in which a show would be produced independently and then sold station by station. After the deal was reached, 5 CBS-owned and operated stations bought the show's first season. Grade's biggest ask of Brillstein was that Jim and the Muppets shoot the new show at his studio in London. Brillstein agreed without even consulting Jim, and after a deal was reached, he called Henson to tell him the news. Jim's response was simply, "I love you." The Muppets were going to the UK.
This episode of DefunctTV is sponsored by Squarespace.
I should have used Squarespace.
Yes, Cody should have used Squarespace. Because with Squarespace's all-in-one website design tools, creating a beautiful, well-performing website is just a few clicks away. Best of all, when it comes to maintaining it, it is easy peasy, lemon squeezy. so you can avoid those nasty 404 errors and even nastier 404 whacks. And now, Squarespace is offering a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. Just go to squarespace.com/defunctland and use the code DEFUNCTLAND. Or click the link in the description to sign up and start designing your website. That's squarespace.com/defunctland.